Okay, we now welcome on to the show Dr. Joe Kosterich. Now, Joe, I love your Twitter feed because you're you're a professional doctor. You want to help people live better. You want to, help enrich lives, but you're fighting against a number of public health campaigns. So, why is that?
Look, that's a really nice sort of simple question to start out with. Look, ultimately it's about the individual being in charge of their own health, and public health messages have their role, but they're often one size fits all, and they're not necessarily applicable to everybody, and they're often, unfortunately, wrong. In particular, for example, we see a lot of obesity, overweight and type 2 diabetes in society today. This has come about after the introduction of low-fat dietary guidelines. So everybody was told to eat the way the experts told us. People have done that. You can see the consequences. Do they admit they're wrong? Unfortunately not. For example, we're probably talking a bit more about vaping later. We see in international jurisdictions that smoking rates are falling in the US, in the UK, in the EU, in Japan, where they have something called IQOS, which is related. And in Australia, we stick our fingers in our ears and go la, 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 la. So, I suppose personally, when I look at people that I'm seeing each day who are trying to do the best with their health and they're getting advice that really is not suitable for them, then, look, I suppose it's a matter of making in your own way, trying to make a bit of a stand and help those people and challenge the unaccountable and unelected bureaucrats who often make these edicts.
So, Dr. Joe, now Gideon Rosner, a person here at the IPA, brought you to us. Do some of his health decisions, do they worry you? Some of the decisions Gideon makes about his body and things like that?
Look, I've got to say I'm not Gideon's doctor, so I don't actually know what he does.
Are you familiar with whiskey?
Yes. Look,
he needs help.
It's put it this way. Ultimately, every person is responsible for their own health and have to make their own decisions, and part of that means living with the consequences. So is it a problem to have a glass of whiskey or a glass or two of wine with your dinner? The answer to that is no. Is there an amount of alcohol that is damaging to our health? The answer to that is yes, there is. And if you drink that amount on a consistent basis, then you will end up with problems. Is it a good idea to smoke? Absolutely not. We know that it's associated with a number of illnesses. Is it a good idea to do some exercise because we know that regular exercise is good for your health? Yes, it is. Now, if people know all of that and in full knowledge make their own decisions, then look, at the end of the day, this is where I think there is a difference between respect for the individual and trying to impose on the individual. And I think we should, allow people to make their own decisions, but make those decisions based on, useful, practical and, I suppose, factual information. And that also means that what we know today might be different to what we knew 10 years ago, and it might be different again in another 10 years' time. But look, Gideon, like you, like me, like everybody else, has to make their decisions and I suppose see what happens as a consequence of those decisions.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Now, you brought up before vaping, and this is like, I got two things we want to talk about. So there's going to be vaping and then medicinal cannabis at the end. But vaping is,
signposting
for me, like the big public health thing for the next couple of years. And as you point out, in places where vaping gets deregulated and people can buy it, smoking rates fall. In Australia, we're dragging our feet. I'm pretty sure it's still, like, where is vaping right now?
Look, it's where it's always been, and it's in this. It is technically illegal, although there is a loophole. Now, I suppose for people who might not be familiar with vaping and wondering what we're talking about, it's inhaling nicotine liquid rather than burning tobacco. Now, basically people smoke because they want some nicotine. And some people say it makes them a little bit less stressed. Some people says it makes them feel better. Most people smoke because they started at some point and they can't actually quit. Most smokers actually would want to quit. Some don't, but they can't, and they've tried all the methods. And our rates of smoking in this country have pretty much flatlined since 2013, and that's despite Australia having plain packaging and having the highest per stick cigarette prices in the world. And some people actually do just enjoy nicotine. It's a terrible thing to say because it's all sort of politically incorrect, but it's true. So when people vape, they're getting nicotine, which is not of itself a carcinogen. So it's not nicotine that causes lung cancer. It's not nicotine that causes throat cancer or heart disease or any of these other problems. It is a whole host of chemicals released by burning and combusting tobacco. So when you extract the nicotine, put it into a liquid form, people use that. Firstly, there's no smoke, so there's no secondhand smoke. And number two, whilst it is not harmless, and I really want to be very clear that people who don't smoke at all should not be taking up vaping, but for those who do, it is a far less harmful option.
So there's places overseas where this is legal. So what if you can see it improving health in those places, why does it seem to take so long for us out here?
Yeah, and that's again an excellent question. And to be honest, I have to declare I'm the chairman of the board of ATRA, which is Australian Tobacco Harm Reduction Association. Look, I think if we knew the answer in this country, we probably wouldn't be having these debates still. There is unfortunately in health a lot of ideology, and there are a lot of people in the tobacco, in the quit space and the anti-tobacco and tobacco control lobbies who have invested their whole lives in being anti the tobacco industry. And I get that, and fair enough, and I sympathise with that. However, this is not about the tobacco industry. This is about individual people trying to reduce their harm. So somewhere along the line, it's morphed from being what can we do to get people to stop smoking, and it's somehow gotten into what can we do that is perceived as being harmful to the tobacco industry. And those two things might have an overlap, but they're not the same. Now, because some of the tobacco companies have moved into the space, and in Australia their percentage of the market is minimal, it's seen as a big tobacco conspiracy and plot. Whereas in actual fact, it is, it basically is a potential solution to the problem that these people are trying to combat. But look, there's a lot of egos invested. There's a lot of history in all of this, and ultimately, it's ideologically driven. A lot of it, because if you look at the science, according to Public Health England, vaping is at least 95% less harmful than smoking. Now, you will see that figure questioned, and I'm yet to hear anybody who questions it or criticises that figure come up with another one. Let's assume it's 50%.
Yeah,
but let's say that they're really out by a massive amount. It's only 50% less. How can 50% less harmful be a bad thing? And should it be more difficult to buy a less harmful option than a more harmful option? You can buy nicotine patches at the supermarket. Now, you can go to Woolies or Coles and buy nicotine patches without a prescription, not even at the chemist, at the supermarket. So if nicotine was that harmful, how come we allow that? Or chewing gums or sprays. Put it into a liquid, all of a sudden we have this enormous problem with it.
Yeah, so a quick case study, like with my friends, I have a lot of friends who were smokers, and they got together to buy a bunch of vapes from overseas, get it over to Australia. And because it was so, and they all quit smoking for a while based on that, but because it was so hard to do it again, a lot of them have gone back to actual smoking cigarettes. And you just think, how is that the journey we want these people to take?
And that is a terrible outcome.
Yeah.
And that is really the worst outcome. And that's what we're seeing in this country. And ultimately, if one has a prescription from a doctor for nicotine liquid, then it can be legally imported for personal use from overseas. But most people don't know that, and most doctors don't know that, and most doctors would be a little bit sort of wary and reticent. There are a couple, and I don't want to give any names in a public domain, but there are a couple of businesses, one that is domiciled in New Zealand, because New Zealand has legalised for vaping and actually actively promoting it. Not only is it now legal, the New Zealand Health Department is encouraging people to switch to vaping. In particular, they're encouraging the Maori population, because the rates of smoking in there are much higher than the general population. In Australia, we know that in Indigenous populations, the rates of smoking are a lot higher. And these people have a shorter life expectancy. And what are we doing? We're basically putting barriers in their path.
Now, over in the US, vaping is a bit of a different one, and the debate that made its way all the way to Donald Trump was that 3 people died from smoking THC-related vapes. I can, immediately, like we said, if it was 50% healthier, a lot more than people than 3 died from smoking tobacco last year, but, it just seems to be these 3 deaths are different. And then the reports come out that they all bought those vapes on the black market. So wouldn't further banning drive more people to the black market that actually killed those people?
Yeah. And look, to summarise that, we've got a cup here.
Yeah.
If I put water into that cup, and a bit of product placement there.
Yeah.
If I put water into that cup and drink it, that's all good. I'll have some water, that's fine. If I put arsenic into that cup and drink it, it's probably not going to end very well for me. So the argument then becomes drinking from a cup is deadly. So yes, those deaths in America, and it is a real concern there, have come because people have used illicit, so this is illegally purchased THC that has also been diluted with vitamin E oil. So you've got these sort of cartridges that have started their lives in China, have been imported into Los Angeles. They go through a whole sort of black market system. People who are selling illegal THC are obviously trying to increase their profit margins so they can dilute it with vitamin E oil. And because vitamin E oil has a similar viscosity to THC oil, the customer doesn't think they're being duped. And this vitamin E oil and illicit THC has caused significant damage to some people's lungs. And that's a terrible situation. And lack of regulation and black market, as you rightly said, drives this sort of thing. But it's not that it was vaped. So nobody has died from vaping nicotine. With one exception, somebody had a dodgy device and it exploded. So again, problems of the black market. But there have been no deaths from vaping nicotine liquid. In much the same way, there's no deaths from drinking water out of a cup. But if you put poison into a cup and drink it, it's not the cup that's the problem. It's the liquid that you've put into it. Same with these deaths in the US.
And that 100% brings it back to ideology, because if you're going purely fact-based outcomes, you want people off the black market. But if you ban it and it exists, there will be a black market. In any particular industry in the world, that is always the case, and vaping won't be any different.
Look, it isn't. And you see people vaping in Australia. Yeah. And, clearly prohibition doesn't tend to work terribly well. So for those people who figured their way around the system, they've gone online, they've done what they need to do. Some of them may be technically in breach of the laws. Others may have gone through, and there are, as I mentioned, some legal channels. Difficult, but doable. The people who really probably don't do that are not the people up and down Collins Street or Pitt Street or St George's Terrace in Perth who are, probably got a few dollars in their pocket, probably reasonably well educated, have the resources. People with mental health problems, where we know that something like 80% plus smoke, and a lot of those people do, particularly with schizophrenia, because nicotine has to them, a perceived beneficial effect. We know Indigenous populations, as I mentioned, homeless people, very high rates of smoking in lower SES areas and amongst single mothers. These people probably aren't going online and doing clever things. Not saying that they haven't got the intelligence to do it, but they just don't have the resources or the wherewithal. These are the people who the bans on vaping harm the most. It's not the people in Leichhardt, it's not the people in Fitzroy. It's these people who don't get seen by the elites in their ivory towers who suffer, but they're out of sight and out of mind.
Brilliant. So I want to move on now to medicinal cannabis, which is what you're in Melbourne for. You're speaking in a conference about it. Now, the cannabis debate, and it flared up when Canberra sort of relaxed a few of the laws in Canberra around it. And cannabis to me is such an interesting area. I was listening to the Joe Rogan podcast with Malcolm Gladwell, and shockingly enough, drugs came up on the Joe Rogan podcast. But Malcolm Gladwell asked, if you only had the facts in front of you, you didn't have any societal stigmas, you only just had the facts in front of you, and you're building a new society. And of the three things alcohol, cannabis, and smoking, which one would be the most regulated if you just remove stigma? And I don't know which would be the most regulated, but based on the facts that are out there, surely cannabis would be the least regulated for the effect it has on people's lives, for the effect it has on crime, for the effect it has on life expectancy. So why does this stigma exist so much?
How many years have we got again?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so having looked a little bit into the history of this, but also having listened to people who've delved a lot more into the history, use of cannabis in human society dates back quite a few thousand years, and it seems to be in a whole host of different cultures and countries, and was used for medical purposes up until the 1920s and 30s. In fact, it was only removed from the American pharmacopoeia in about 1942. And the uses for medicinal cannabis in those days were pretty much the same as what it's being used for again today, which is and includes chronic pain, multiple sclerosis, spasticity, some forms of epilepsy, nausea and vomiting associated with chemotherapy and cancer. So when you look at why did it become illegal and why the stigma, it really appears to have a lot to do with probably two things, in my opinion. One is race relations in the United States, and a contemporary of J. Edgar Hoover, most people have heard of him, was a fellow called Harry J. Anslinger, who was the head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, the forerunner to the DEA. And he had a particular view that the use of cannabis, and he coined the term marijuana, to make it sound Mexican. So, some things haven't changed. So he coined that term to make it sound like it was foreign, and he stated to Congress that the use of marijuana will make the black man feel he's as good as the white man. I mean, obviously, he couldn't say that these days, but that's what he said, and this is actual testimony to Congress, and that it will cause white women to want to have sexual relations with African Americans. I think they're using that term in those days. And he was very persuasive and drove those arguments against, at that time, the attitude of the American Medical Association, who argued that it should continue to be used. And obviously in the 30s, prohibition of alcohol was ending. Anslinger came from a prohibition background. A whole lot of people looking for something to do. If you're in the prohibition business and suddenly you're out of work, prohibition is a good industry to get into. Let's prohibit something else. And there was a fictitious film that came out called Reefer Madness. It was a Hollywood movie. And that also gained some traction, that, there were all these terrible effects from cannabis. Now, a bit like alcohol, if you have a glass or two, then it's not going to be a problem. If people use particularly high formulation THC illicitly, consistently, then there are going to be some problems with that. Medicinal is very and completely, and I really want to underline this, completely different to recreational use.
Sorry.
I was just going to say, so me and James talked about that when they made those changes to the ACT laws, how only politicians say cannabis. So thanks for clearing that up for us about how that came about. We'll just quickly, you've been watching these things for a while. Do you see that happening in other states as well? What happened in the ACT?
Yeah. Look, if one looks internationally, in Canada, they've had medicinal cannabis since the early 2000s. Last year, they legalised for recreational cannabis. In the United States, which is the home of the war on drugs, it remains illegal federally, but I think there are now 12 states which have legal recreational cannabis. There are now 47 states that have legalised medicinal cannabis in some form. Some it's CBD or cannabidiol only, some it's full medicinal cannabis. New Zealand is going to a referendum next year about legalisation. It's probable that at some point in the future that Australia may well decide to go down that path. And I suspect that the different states may look at it. So I don't see anything immediately on the agenda, no.
Okay. Right.
But if you sort of say, well, what might happen in 10 or 20 years' time? Well, again, if you look around the world, you can sort of see there is a movement towards freeing up restrictions around cannabis use. But again, I really want to emphasise that that's not sort of a discussion at the moment. Really, the main issue at the moment is access to medicinal cannabis, and that is a completely different beast.
All right, brilliant. So Dr. Joe Kosterich, where can people follow you on Twitter?
Look, they can get on to Dr. Joe's DIY Health. If they go to the website, drjoe.net.au, you can sort of find me on the usual social medias.
Okay, brilliant.
Any medical questions, just fire them in.
All right, fire them in. All right, thank you so much for joining us on the show.
You're very welcome.
Thanks, Dr. Joe.